The young billionaire never imagined that he would end up sitting in front of that small, unpainted blockhouse with a rusted zinc roof, tears slowly gathering in his eyes. But what he was about to discover in that place would forever change the way he viewed his own life. Because sometimes the greatest truth is not found in the luxurious mansions of Banana Island, but in the most humble compounds of the mainland. And that afternoon, he was about to learn that lesson in the most unexpected way. But before we continue with this story, if you like stories that touch the heart and remind us of what truly matters in life, I invite you to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you won't miss any of our stories. And now I want to ask you a very important question. As you listen to this story, from which country are you watching us? Write it in the comments. I love reading about where you are joining us from. Now, let's get back to this story because it all began on a quiet afternoon when a bright red Mercedes G-Wagon slowly appeared on a dusty, untarred road in Agege, where cars like that were almost never seen. The deep purr of the engine immediately caught the attention of some neighbors who were sitting on wooden benches in front of their compounds. In that small, bustling neighborhood, luxury cars were not a common sight, much less one like that. The vehicle stopped in front of a small house, built with plastered walls weathered by the rainy seasons and a roof made of old corrugated iron sheets. The house was simple, very simple, but it had something special. There were flowers in empty paint buckets hanging by the windows. A small wooden fence surrounded the compound, and at the entrance, an old wooden door looked like it had been repaired many times. It was the kind of house that spoke of hustle, of sacrifice, and of dignity. From the red G-Wagon stepped down an elegant young man, dressed in a perfectly tailored dark native senator wear. His expensive wristwatch gleamed with the reflection of the late afternoon sun. His spotless designer shoes contrasted sharply with the red dust of the street. His presence did not go unnoticed. It was obvious that this big man did not belong to that place. His name was Chikezi Okafor. At 32 years old, Chikezi was known in Lagos as one of the youngest and most successful businessmen in Nigeria. He had built an impressive fortune in a very short time. Tech startups, real estate investments in Lekki and Victoria Island, international projects. His name constantly appeared in business magazines. Many admired him, others envied him, but almost no one truly knew the man that existed behind that image of success. Chikezi was brilliant, ambitious, and determined, but also deeply lonely. For years, his life had turned into a cold and calculated routine. Board meetings, contracts, flights to Abuja and London, more meetings. The naira and dollars grew, but the emptiness did too. However, that afternoon he had not come to that place for business, nor for an investment, nor out of mere curiosity. He had come for a very specific reason, a reason that had been lingering in his mind for days, a reason that had not let him sleep well. The house in front of him belonged to someone he knew very well, or at least thought he knew. It was the house of Auntie Ngozi, the woman who worked as the housekeeper in his massive Banana Island mansion. Ngozi had been working for him for over 3 years, always punctual, always silent, always efficient. She was one of those people who seemed invisible in the lives of the rich. She arrived early, cleaned, arranged the house, cooked when necessary, and then left without making a noise. Chikezi almost never spoke to her, not because he was wicked, but simply because he had never considered it necessary. In his world, people like Ngozi were part of the functioning of the house, like the Italian furniture, like the generator, like the manicured lawn. They were just there, and that was it. But something had changed a few days ago, something that awakened a strange curiosity in him. One morning, while hurriedly leaving his house for an important meeting, Chikezi had noticed something different. Ngozi was in the kitchen, preparing breakfast, but she was not alone. She was speaking in a low voice on her phone, and what he heard made Chikezi stop for a few seconds. "No wahala, I will bring some food today," she said in a sweet but tired tone. "I know you are waiting." That sentence had been etched in Chikezi's mind, because the tone Ngozi used was completely different from the one she used in the house. It was a tone full of tenderness, of affection, of worry, something Chikezi had never seen in her. When she noticed his presence, Ngozi quickly hung up the call and continued working as if nothing had happened. But from that moment, something began to trouble Chikezi. For days he couldn't stop thinking about it. Who was Ngozi calling? Who was waiting for that food? Why did she seem so worried? It wasn't his business at all, but still, he couldn't get that scene out of his head. Perhaps because in the middle of his perfectly organized life, that small scene represented something different, something human, something real, something he couldn't buy with money. So one afternoon, driven by a curiosity that not even he fully understood, he decided to follow her. Not in an obsessive way, not like in a Nollywood movie, simply keeping a certain distance when she left the mansion after work. Ngozi walked a few streets, then took a Danfo bus, and finally dropped off in this humble neighborhood in Agege. Chikezi followed the route in his G-Wagon without knowing exactly what he expected to find. And now, there he was in front of the house of the woman who cleaned his enormous mansion every day. The difference between their two worlds was impossible to ignore. His house had more than 15 rooms, a swimming pool, massive gardens, and entertainment lounges. This house barely had 2 rooms, maybe a small parlor, but something about that place made him stand there observing for several minutes. There was life there. It was obvious. Clothes were drying on a line. A small plastic tricycle leaned near the door, and children's drawings were taped to one of the windows. Chikezi frowned slightly. A tricycle. Ngozi had a child. He had never asked himself that. In fact, he had never asked himself anything about Ngozi's life. At that moment, the door of the house opened, and Ngozi appeared. She was still wearing her light blue uniform. In her hands, she held a small plastic tray. On it was a cup of hot Milo and a few slices of Agege bread. When she saw the red G-Wagon parked in front of her compound, she froze completely. Her eyes widened with shock. "Oga Chikezi," she murmured, unable to believe what she was seeing. The young billionaire took a step toward her. He didn't know exactly what to say. The situation was strange even for him. He finally spoke. "I didn't mean to surprise you, Ngozi, but the truth is I needed to talk to you." Ngozi looked at the car, then looked at her house, and finally looked back at him. There was a mixture of nervousness and worry on her face. "Did something happen at the house, sir?" Chikezi shook his head. "No." But then his eyes dropped to the tray she was holding, the Milo, the bread, 2 cups, as if she was serving someone. Chikezi slowly looked up. "Can I ask you something, Ngozi?" She nodded timidly. "Of course, sir. Who is that breakfast for?" Ngozi hesitated for just a few seconds, but those seconds felt eternal. Her eyes darted slightly toward the inside of the house, as if she was thinking whether she should answer or not. And at that moment, from inside the small house, a child's voice was heard. A soft voice. "Mummy, has he arrived?" Chikezi felt something tighten inside his chest, because that simple question was about to reveal a story he never imagined. And what Chikezi would discover in that humble house would be something that no business, no money, and no success in the world could prepare him to face. But that is only the beginning of this story, because what happened in that house a few minutes later would make the young billionaire Chikezi Okafor end up crying like never before in his life. And the reason was much deeper than anyone could imagine. Chikezi stood motionless in front of the door of that small house. The boy's voice still echoed in the air. "Mummy, has he arrived?" It was a sweet, innocent voice, but there was also something in it, something Chikezi couldn't explain at that moment. Perhaps it was the way it had been pronounced, as if the boy was waiting for something very important. Ngozi slowly looked down at the tray she held in her hands. Then she took a deep breath. For a second, she seemed to debate internally, but finally, she looked up at Chikezi. "Oga, her voice trembled slightly. "I didn't expect you to come here." Chikezi didn't expect to be there either. In fact, if someone had told him that same morning that he would end up standing in front of his cleaner's humble house, he probably would have thought it was absurd. But now he was there, and something inside him told him he shouldn't leave just yet. "Don't worry, Ngozi," he said calmly. "I just came to speak with you for a moment." But then he heard the boy's voice again, this time a little louder. "Mummy." The voice came from inside the house. Chikezi looked toward the open door, and for the first time, he felt a different kind of curiosity. It wasn't the cold curiosity of business. It was something more human, more personal. Ngozi hesitated for a few more seconds. Then she spoke softly. "Come inside, sir." Chikezi was a bit surprised. He didn't expect that invitation, but he slowly walked toward the entrance of the house. The interior was small, very small, compared to any space in his mansion, but it was incredibly neat. There was a simple wooden table in the center, 2 plastic chairs, a small worn-out sofa, and in a corner, a shelf full of exercise books, colored pencils, and some modest toys. Chikezi noticed something immediately. Everything was clean, impeccably clean. It was obvious that Ngozi cared for that place with the same effort with which she cared for his house. But then he saw him. A little boy was sitting on a chair near the table. He looked about 6 or 7 years old, with dark hair, big eyes, and an expression full of curiosity. When he saw Chikezi, the boy frowned a little. He didn't seem scared, just surprised. "Mummy, who is he?" Ngozi placed the tray on the table. "He is my boss, Obina." The boy opened his eyes wider. "Your boss?" Chikezi felt strangely uncomfortable. He wasn't used to that kind of introduction. In his world, people rarely spoke of him as the boss in such simple terms. They usually called him Mr. Okafor, or CEO, or director. But in that small house, he was simply the boss. Obina observed Chikezi from head to toe. Then he pointed at the tailored outfit. "You look very sharp." Chikezi couldn't help but smile slightly. "Thank you." Ngozi quickly took the cup of Milo and moved it closer to the boy. "Drink your tea first." Obina obeyed. Chikezi stood watching the scene in silence. There was something profoundly simple in that moment, something that seemed almost foreign to him. A mother, a son, a small meal, something so common and at the same time so distant from his own life. Chikezi noticed something else. On the table was a small plate with slices of agege bread, but it was obvious there wasn't much else. The food was simple, very simple. Ngozi looked back at Chikezi. "Oga, you said you wanted to talk to me?" Chikezi took a few seconds to answer. He was still processing what he was seeing. "I didn't know you had a son." Ngozi nodded softly. "Yes, this is Obina." The boy raised his hand. "Good afternoon, sir." Chikezi responded with a small nod. "Good afternoon, Obina." Obina took another sip of his Milo. Then he looked at Chikezi with curiosity again. "Are you the one that lives in the big house?" Chikezi was surprised. "The big house?" Obina nodded enthusiastically. "Yes, Mummy says she cleans a very, very big house." Ngozi became slightly nervous. "Obina," but Chikezi raised a hand calmly. "It's fine." Then he looked at the boy. "Yes, that is my house." Obina's eyes widened with fascination. "Does it have a swimming pool?" Chikezi nodded. "Yes. And a cinema too?" Obina stayed thoughtful for a few seconds, then said something that made Chikezi feel a strange discomfort. "It must be very beautiful to live there." Chikezi didn't know how to respond, because for the first time, the question didn't seem so simple. Ngozi quickly changed the subject. "Obina, finish your bread." But Chikezi noticed something. Obina wasn't eating the bread, he was only drinking the Milo. Chikezi frowned slightly. "Do you not like the bread?" The boy looked at the plate, then looked at his mother. Ngozi spoke quickly. "Yes, he likes it." Obina hesitated. Then he said in a low voice, "I am keeping some." Chikezi tilted his head. "Keeping some?" The boy nodded. "For later." But Chikezi noticed something strange in Ngozi's expression. There was a subtle tension in her face, as if something wasn't right. Chikezi looked at the plate again. It was a small portion, very small, and suddenly he remembered the phone call he had heard days before. "I will bring some food today." The sentence returned to his mind, and then Chikezi asked a question that would completely change the course of that afternoon. "Ngozi, do you always eat breakfast with your son before going to work?" Ngozi hesitated for a second. "Two." Then she answered, "Not always." Chikezi carefully observed her reaction. "Why not?" Ngozi avoided his gaze. "Sometimes I leave the house very early." Obina spoke up suddenly. "Sometimes Mummy doesn't eat." Ngozi turned quickly toward him. "Obina," but it was too late. Chikezi felt something inside his chest tighten. "What do you mean?" Obina answered with total naturalness. "Sometimes she says she already ate at the big house." Chikezi remained completely silent, because he knew perfectly well that this wasn't true. He had never seen Ngozi eat breakfast in his house, not even once. Suddenly, everything began to click. The phone call, the food, the worry in her voice, the small portion of bread, the way Obina saved part of his meal. Chikezi felt an uncomfortable sensation, a mixture of surprise and something else, something that felt a lot like guilt. But he still needed to understand something that didn't make sense yet. "Ngozi," he said slowly, "you always bring food from my house." Silence filled the room. Ngozi looked down. Obina kept drinking his Milo without fully understanding what was happening. Several seconds passed until finally, Ngozi spoke. Her voice was soft, but firm. "I don't steal anything, sir." Chikezi quickly raised his head. "I didn't say that." Ngozi looked him straight in the eyes. "But I thought that was what you were thinking." Chikezi felt an even greater discomfort, because the truth was, he had thought that for a moment, but now he wasn't so sure. Ngozi took a deep breath. Then she explained calmly, "Sometimes, when there is leftover food in the kitchen, I pack it." Chikezi listened in silence. In his house, plates of jollof rice, fried chicken, and fresh fruits that were still in perfectly good condition were often thrown away. That was true, very true. Chikezi had never thought much about it, but hearing it now sounded different, very different. Ngozi continued, "And when that happens, I bring a little home." Chikezi looked at Obina. The boy had already finished his Milo. For him, Ngozi nodded slowly. For him, silence filled the small house again. But this time, it was a much heavier silence, because Chikezi was beginning to understand something he had never considered. While in his house, whole plates of food were wasted, in that small house, every piece of agege bread was important, and that simple reality began to strike something very deep inside him. But Chikezi still didn't know that the most shocking thing was yet to be discovered, because a few seconds later, Obina would ask a question that would leave the young billionaire completely speechless. And that question would be the beginning of something Chikezi would never forget. The silence inside the small house seemed to have grown heavier. Chikezi remained standing, looking at the simple table, the empty plastic cup, and the small plate with bread that Obina had barely touched. The scene was so simple, but at the same time so revealing. For years, Chikezi had lived surrounded by abundance. In his house, massive breakfasts were prepared every day: fresh fruits, warm bread, natural juices, freshly brewed coffee, yam, and egg sauce. And often half of that food ended up in the dustbin. He had never thought much about it. It was simply part of the routine, part of a comfortable life. But now, sitting in that small parlor in Agege where every piece of bread seemed to have value, that reality started to look different. Very different. Obina finished his drink and placed the cup on the table. Then he looked at Chikezi with the natural curiosity of a child. "Do you have children, sir?" The question came unexpectedly. Chikezi took a second to answer. "No." Obina tilted his head slightly. "Why?" Chikezi let out a small, uncomfortable smile. "I guess I never found the time." Obina frowned, trying to understand something very complicated. "And you live alone in that very big house?" "Yes." The boy looked toward the window, then looked back at Chikezi. "It must be very quiet." That sentence, spoken with total innocence, hit Chikezi in a strange way, because it was true. His house was quiet, too quiet. For a moment, Chikezi imagined his Lekki mansion, the enormous bedrooms, the long corridors, the empty spaces, everything perfectly designed, perfectly arranged, perfectly empty. Obina spoke again. "I don't like silence." Ngozi gently stroked her son's hair. "Obina," but the boy continued talking naturally. "Sometimes when mummy goes to work all day, the house gets very quiet." Chikezi looked up. "Do you stay alone?" Ngozi answered quickly. "Only for a few hours, sir. After that, Iya Basira, a neighbor, comes to check on him." But Obina spoke again. "Sometimes I wait for mummy by the window." Chikezi felt something tighten inside his chest. He didn't know exactly why. Maybe because suddenly that small house didn't seem as simple as before. It seemed full of stories. Obina looked at Chikezi again. "And why did you come here?" The question was direct, simple, and completely logical. Chikezi looked at Ngozi, then at the boy, and for the first time, he didn't know what to say, because the truth was that not even he fully understood why he had come. Curiosity, restlessness, boredom, maybe a bit of everything, but now that he was there, he felt there was something more, something he still couldn't identify. Before Chikezi could answer, Obina asked another question, a question that would completely change the direction of the conversation. "Are you good to my mummy?" Ngozi quickly raised her head. "Obina." But Chikezi didn't take his eyes off the boy. "Why do you ask that?" Obina shrugged. "Because sometimes she comes back very tired." Silence returned to the room. Chikezi looked at Ngozi. She avoided his gaze. Obina continued talking with total honesty, but she always says her work is important. Ngozi spoke softly. "Obina, that's enough." But the boy didn't seem to be done. "She says that if she hustles hard, one day everything will be better." Chikezi felt every word slowly drop inside him, because he had never thought of Ngozi's work that way. To him, She was simply someone who performed a function in his house. But to Obina, that work represented something much bigger. It represented hope, it represented sacrifice, it represented the future. Obina looked at Chikezi again. "Do you know something?" Chikezi tilted his head slightly. "What?" Obina hesitated for a second, then said something that left the young billionaire completely motionless. "My mummy says you are a good man." Chikezi's heart gave an unexpected little jump, because those words were absolutely not what he expected to hear. He slowly looked at Ngozi. She looked uncomfortable. "Obina," she murmured, but the boy continued. "She says you work very hard, and that is why you have such a big house." Chikezi felt a strange mixture of emotions: pride, discomfort, confusion. Obina rested his elbows on the table. "Is it true that when someone works very hard, they can have a big house?" Chikezi answered slowly. "Sometimes, yes." Obina smiled. "Then, my mummy should have one too." The air in the room seemed to stop for a second. Chikezi didn't know what to say, because in the simple logic of the child, that made all the sense in the world. Ngozi worked incredibly hard, much harder than Chikezi had imagined, but her house was small, very small. Obina looked down at the plate, then broke the small agege bread in two, kept one half, and began to eat the other. Chikezi observed the gesture. "Why are you keeping the other part?" Obina answered without looking up. "For later." "For you?" Obina shook his head. "For mummy." Ngozi closed her eyes for an instant. Chikezi felt something shudder inside him, something deep, something he wasn't used to feeling. For years he had heard motivational speeches about sacrifice, about hard work, about the hustle, but seeing that small gesture was completely different. It was real, it was human. Obina looked up again. "Do you want some tea?" Chikezi blinked in surprise. "What?" Obina pointed to the tray. "Mummy made extra Milo." Chikezi looked at the second cup. It was still steaming, but at that moment he understood something. That cup probably wasn't for him, it was for someone else. "Who was that tea for?" Ngozi. Ngozi hesitated, but Obina answered first. "For the man at the provision shop." Chikezi frowned slightly. "Which man?" Obina spoke naturally. "Oga Emeka." "Who is Emeka?" Ngozi took a deep breath. She knew she couldn't hide it anymore. "He owns the provision store down the street." Chikezi didn't understand. "And why do you take tea to him?" Obina answered again. "Because he lets mummy buy things on GBs, on credit." The silence became absolute. Ngozi closed her eyes for a moment. Chikezi felt as if one more piece of the puzzle had just fallen into place. "You have debts at the provision store?" Ngozi answered calmly. "Just a little." Chikezi looked around the house. The simple table, the modest furniture, the cheap toys, everything began to acquire a different meaning. "Why didn't you tell me anything?" Ngozi looked up. "Because it is not your problem, sir." The answer was calm, dignified, but Chikezi couldn't help but feel a pang in his chest, because for the first time he understood something he had never considered. While he made decisions worth millions of naira every day, the woman who kept his house clean struggled every week to buy food. And yet she had never begged for anything, never complained, never told her story. Obina spoke again. "But Oga Emeka is a good man." Chikezi looked at the boy. "Why do you say that?" Obina smiled. "Because he never tells us no." Chikezi felt something slowly break inside him, because suddenly he understood something painful. To that child, a man who simply allowed them to pay later was already considered someone good. And then Obina asked one last question, a simple but devastating question. "Are you also good to my mummy?" The young billionaire, Chikezi Okafor, couldn't answer, because for the first time in a long time, he wasn't sure what the real answer was. And in that moment, something inside him began to change, although he still didn't know to what extent that small house and that boy were about to completely transform his life. The question still hung in the air. "Are you also good to my mummy?" Chikezi remained silent. It wasn't a difficult question, at least not in appearance. But inside him, something was shifting, something uncomfortable, something he wasn't used to confronting. For years, he had answered complex questions in front of investors, politicians, journalists, and lawyers. He had defended multi-million naira projects, closed massive deals, made decisions that moved giant figures. But that question, the simple question of a child sitting at a humble table, had left him completely speechless. Chikezi slowly looked at Ngozi. She was standing next to the table, her hands slightly clasped in front of her blue uniform. She didn't look angry or resentful. She just looked calm. calm in a way that was almost unnerving. Obina was waiting for the answer. "So?" asked the boy. Chikezi took a deep breath. "I try to be." Obina tilted his head. "Is trying the same as being?" The question landed again with the force of a simple truth. Chikezi let out a small, nervous laugh. "Sometimes no." Obina seemed to reflect on that. Then he simply nodded. "Okay." And he continued eating the small piece of bread he had broken off. Chikezi watched the gesture. It was a minimal gesture, but every small detail of that scene seemed to carry an enormous weight, because for the first time in a long time, Chikezi was seeing something that his life normally shielded him from. Real life, without filters, without luxury, without packaging, just ordinary Nigerians trying to survive. Obina finished eating, then took the empty cup and carefully placed it on the tray. "Thank you for the tea, Mummy." Ngozi smiled. "You're welcome, my son." Chikezi observed something else. There was no rush in that house. No ringing phones, no urgent emails, no board meetings. Everything seemed to move at a different pace, a slower, more human pace. Obina looked at Chikezi again. "You work all day." "Almost the whole day." Obina frowned slightly. "That must be very tiring." Chikezi shrugged. "It's part of the hustle." The boy seemed to think of something. Then he asked, "And do you like it?" Chikezi took a few seconds to answer. "Yes, I think so." But as he said it, he felt strange, because the answer no longer seemed as clear as before. Obina continued watching him. "My mummy also works a lot, I know, but when she comes back we always play for a while." Ngozi smiled softly. "Obina," but the boy didn't seem to have any intention of stopping, even when she is tired. Chikezi looked at Ngozi. She lowered her gaze slightly. "It is important to spend time with him." Obina got up from the chair, walked to a small shelf in the corner of the parlor. From there, he took an exercise book full of drawings. He returned to the table and opened it in front of Chikezi. "See?" Chikezi leaned in. The book was full of drawings made with colored pencils, houses, trees, people, and in many of them, Ngozi appeared. In some drawings, Obina had drawn himself next to her. In others, they were holding hands. In others, they were simply sitting together. But one of the drawings particularly caught Chikezi's attention. It was a house, a big house, a very big house, much larger than the small block house they were in. It had huge windows, a garden, and a swimming pool. Obina pointed at the drawing. "That is your house." Chikezi was surprised. "Ah, mine?" Obina nodded enthusiastically. "Yes, Mummy told me how it looks." Chikezi looked at the drawing. It was a child's representation of his Banana Island mansion, but what really caught his attention was something else. In the drawing, there were 3 people in front of the house: Obina, Ngozi, and another figure. Chikezi pointed at that third figure. "Who is that?" Obina smiled. "You." Chikezi blinked. "Me?" "Yes." Chikezi looked back at the drawing. "And why am I there?" Obina answered with total naturalness. "Because in my story, you invited my mummy to live in that house." Ngozi let out a small, nervous laugh. "Obina," but the boy continued, "so she wouldn't have to suffer and work so much." The air seemed to become thicker. Chikezi looked at the drawing again. No one had ever drawn him inside a story like that. Never. In his world, people saw him as an entrepreneur, a boss, a moneymaker. But to that child, he was a character in a dream where his mother wouldn't have to suffer so much. Obina closed the notebook. "But Mummy says that will not happen." Chikezi looked up. "Why?" Obina answered with the same calmness as always. "Because rich people don't do those things." Silence filled the small house again. Chikezi felt an unexpected pang in his chest, because the boy hadn't said that with resentment or sadness. He simply said it as someone describing a rule of the world in Nigeria, as something that was the way it was and would always be. Chikezi looked at Ngozi. "Did you tell him that?" Ngozi answered softly. "I explained to him how the world works." Chikezi slowly rested a hand on the table. "Maybe the world doesn't always work like that." Obina raised his eyebrows. "Then, it could happen?" Chikezi hesitated because he didn't know what to answer, and for the first time in a long time, he felt completely out of his comfort zone. Obina walked to the window. He looked at the red G-Wagon parked outside. "That car is very fine. Thank you." "How much is it?" Chikezi let out a small laugh. "A lot." Obina thought for a few seconds. "More than this house?" Chikezi looked at him. He didn't expect that question. Yes. Obina looked back at the car. Then it is very expensive. Chikezi felt something strange, because suddenly that comparison seemed absurd, a car that cost more than a child's home. Obina returned to the table. Do you know something? What? Obina smiled. When I grow up, I want to buy a bigger house for Mummy. Chikezi looked at him attentively. Why? Obina answered as if it were the most logical thing in the world. Because she works too much. Ngozi gently rubbed the boy's shoulder. You don't need to worry about those things. Obina shook his head. Yes, I need to. Obina had said that sentence with a certainty that didn't seem to belong to a child. Yes, I need to. Chikezi observed him closely. The little boy was standing next to the table, still holding the drawing book against his chest. There was no doubt in his voice, no fear, only a quiet conviction, as if that small dream, buying a better house for his mother, was something completely natural, something inevitable. Chikezi felt a strange mix of emotions, admiration, sadness, and a deep discomfort that was slowly settling inside him, because for the first time, he was seeing something he had never considered. To Obina, his mother's work wasn't just sweeping floors and doing laundry, it was a sacrifice, a silent hustle. It was love converted into exhaustion. Ngozi sighed softly. Obina, my dear, you don't have to worry about those things. But the boy shook his head. Yes, I have to. Chikezi tilted his head slightly. Why? Obina answered with total sincerity. Because Mummy always worries about me. That simple sentence seemed to contain a massive truth. Obina kept talking. When I fell sick last year, she didn't sleep at all for many days. Ngozi tried to interrupt him. Obina. But the boy didn't seem to notice his mother's discomfort. She stayed awake all night checking if my body was hot. Chikezi looked at Ngozi. She looked down, slightly embarrassed. Obina continued. And when there was no money for the drugs, she still went to work. Chikezi frowned. There was no money? Ngozi answered quickly. It was a long time ago, sir. It has passed. But Chikezi was paying full attention now. What happened? Ngozi hesitated. It's not important. Obina spoke before his mother could stop him. I had severe typhoid and malaria. Chikezi felt a slight tension in his chest. Obina continued naturally. I was in the clinic for several days. Ngozi closed her eyes for a second. It was obvious she didn't want this story to come to light, but Obina spoke with the pure honesty of children. Mummy stayed with me all day, and then went to work. Chikezi blinked in surprise. After being in the hospital, Ngozi tried to soften the situation. It was just a few difficult days. But Obina spoke again. She sold her gold chain. Chikezi immediately looked up. Her gold chain? Ngozi tensed. Obina, enough. But the boy continued. The chain she kept inside a small box. Chikezi carefully observed Ngozi's face. There was something in her expression, something that looked like a mixture of shame and resignation. What chain was that? Ngozi took a few seconds to answer. Finally, she said in a low voice, It belonged to my late mother. Chikezi felt a small emotional blow inside his chest. And you sold it? Ngozi nodded slowly. To pay for part of the hospital bill and drugs. Silence filled the small house again. Chikezi looked around the faded walls, the simple furniture, the small shelf with modest toys. Everything seemed to tell the same story. A story of hustle, of sacrifice, of silent dignity. Obina approached the table again. But Mummy says, it doesn't matter. Chikezi looked at him. Why? Obina smiled. Because I am fine now. Chikezi felt something tighten in his throat, because the way the boy said it was profoundly moving, as if that simple reality being alive was enough. Obina opened his drawing book again. Look at this one. Chikezi leaned in. The drawing showed a hospital room. There was a bed, a boy lying down, and a woman sitting next to him holding his hand. That day, Mummy didn't leave the whole night. Chikezi looked at the drawing for several seconds. You drew this after? Obina nodded. Yes. Why? Obina answered naturally. Because I wanted to remember. Chikezi felt an unexpected emotion slowly rise inside him, because suddenly he understood something he had never thought about. While he was negotiating million-naira contracts, while he was closing corporate deals, while he was arguing figures in boardrooms, there were people fighting much more important battles. Silent battles, human battles, battles that didn't appear in any business magazine or Forbes list. Ngozi broke the silence. Oga, really, you don't have to trouble yourself about this. Chikezi looked up. But it troubles me. Ngozi shook her head softly. It shouldn't. Chikezi took a deep breath. You have been working in my house for 3 years. Ngozi nodded. Yes, and you never told me any of this. She answered with a calmness that was almost baffling. Because it was not necessary. Chikezi frowned. Not necessary? Chikezi remained seated at the table, still processing everything he had just heard. The story of the clinic, the sold gold chain, the sleepless nights. Every detail began to paint a completely different picture of Ngozi. For 3 years she had been part of his daily life. She had cleaned his house, organized his spaces, prepared his kitchen, and yet he had never truly seen who she was. He had never seen her story, never seen her hustle. Obina kept flipping through his drawing book. He turned page after page with tranquility, as if those stories were simply normal memories. But to Chikezi, every new drawing seemed to open a window to a life he had never imagined. Look at this one, Obina said suddenly. Chikezi tilted his head again. The drawing showed a big house, but this time it wasn't exactly like the previous one. It was different, more detailed. There were trees, a big garden, and in the center, a male figure. That is you again, Obina said with a small smile. Chikezi observed the drawing carefully. It seems you draw me a lot. Obina shrugged. Because Mummy talks about you a lot. Chikezi raised his eyebrows slightly. Oh, really? Obina nodded. She says you are a very hard-working man. Ngozi quickly looked at her son, Obina, but the boy continued speaking with the innocence that characterized him. She says you started from nothing. Chikezi was surprised. She told you that? Obina nodded again. Yes. Chikezi looked at Ngozi. She seemed uncomfortable. I only told him a few things. Obina turned another page of the book. She says that when someone works very hard, they can change their life. Chikezi rested his arms on the table. That is true. Obina looked at him intently. Then, you know how hard it is to start from the bottom. The sentence caught him completely by surprise. For a moment, Chikezi felt as if time had stopped, because Obina wasn't saying that with reproach or accusation. He was simply saying it as a logical conclusion. If Chikezi knew what it was like to start from the bottom, then he should understand what his mother was going through. Chikezi breathed deeply. Yes, I know. Obina smiled. Then, I am sure you understand why Mummy hustles so much. Ngozi closed her eyes for a moment. It was obvious she didn't want the conversation to take that turn, but it was already too late. Obina had opened an emotional door that Chikezi could no longer ignore. Obina, Ngozi said softly, Oga Chikezi didn't come to listen to our stories. But Chikezi raised a hand. It doesn't matter. Then he looked back at the boy. I want to hear. Obina seemed satisfied with that answer. He looked back at his notebook. There is one more. Chikezi waited. Obina turned several pages. Finally, he stopped at a different drawing. It was a darker drawing, made with softer colors. It showed the small house they were in, but there was something different. A female figure was sitting alone at the table with her head slightly bowed and tears drawn on her face. Chikezi felt a small chill run down his spine. When did you draw this one? Obina answered calmly. A few months ago. Chikezi looked up. Why? Obina hesitated for a moment, then spoke in a low voice. That day, Mummy was sad. Ngozi tensed immediately. Obina, but the boy continued. She thought I was sleeping. Chikezi felt something inside him tighten slowly. Why was she sad? Obina answered with a sincerity that only children possess. Because she was afraid of losing her job. The air in the room seemed to grow heavier. Chikezi looked at Ngozi. She no longer avoided his gaze, but in her eyes, there was an emotion that hadn't been there before. That was a long time ago, she said calmly, but Chikezi knew exactly what moment she was referring to. He remembered that week perfectly. He had been reviewing the household expenses and had decided to cut down on some costs, including staff. He had considered laying off 2 workers. One of them had been Ngozi. Ultimately, he didn't do it, but it had been a real possibility. And now he understood something he had never considered. While to him, it had just been another business decision. To Ngozi, it had been a direct threat to the stability of her life, to the security of her son. Obina spoke again. But after that, everything was fine. Chikezi looked at him. Why? Obina smiled. Because Mummy said she would trust in God. Ngozi took a deep breath. Obina, but the boy seemed to have finished his story. He closed the book slowly, and now everything is better. Chikezi observed the small house again, the furniture, the table, the empty plastic cup, the saved bread, and suddenly he understood something that hit him with brutal clarity. Everything was better, but it was still extremely difficult. The struggle was still there. The sacrifice was still there. Only that Ngozi carried it in silence, without anyone knowing, without anyone noticing. Chikezi slowly rested his hands on the table. Ngozi. She looked up. Yes, sir. Chikezi hesitated for a few seconds. Then he asked something he had never asked before in his life. Are you happy? Ngozi seemed surprised by the question. It wasn't something her boss had ever asked her. She thought for a few seconds before answering. I have my son. Chikezi waited. She continued. That is enough for me. The answer was simple, but it carried an enormous weight. Chikezi looked down at the drawing book that was still on the table. Then something unexpected happened. Obinna asked one last question, a question that would completely change what Chikezi was feeling. Do you know something? Chikezi raised his head. What? Obinna looked at him with a soft smile. Mummy says that every day you carry a lot of money in your big car. Chikezi frowned. Money? Obinna nodded. She says you are a very rich big man. Chikezi let out a small laugh. I suppose so. Obinna tilted his head slightly, and then he asked a question that pierced straight through the heart of the young billionaire. Then, why do you look so sad? Chikezi froze completely, because at that moment he understood something he had never understood before. All the money in the world had not taught him to see what truly mattered, and that little boy was beginning to show him a truth that would change his life forever. The question hung suspended in the air. Then, why do you look so sad? Chikezi did not answer immediately. In fact, he couldn't, because for the first time in a long time, someone had looked past his expensive native wear, past his G-Wagon, past his image as a successful Lagos big boy. A 7-year-old boy had seen something no one else seemed to notice. He had seen the sadness. Chikezi looked down at the table. His fingers rested on the worn wood, slowly tracing the small marks of time that covered the surface. Ngozi watched in silence. She said nothing, but in her gaze there was something new, something that hadn't been there when Chikezi arrived. Perhaps understanding, perhaps curiosity, perhaps simply the intuition that something important was happening. Obinna spoke again. My mummy says that when someone is sad, it is because they are missing something. Chikezi slowly looked up. Oh, really? Obinna nodded confidently. Yes. Then he shrugged. Sometimes it's food missing. He looked at the plate on the table. Sometimes it's money missing. Then he looked at his mother. But other times, it's company missing. Those words struck something deep inside Chikezi, because without knowing it, the boy had described exactly what he had been feeling for years. A massive mansion, a garage full of cars, bank accounts with figures that seemed unreal, but long, quiet nights too quiet. Chikezi leaned back slightly in his chair. Your mummy is very wise. Obinna smiled. Yes. Ngozi let out a small, shy laugh. Don't exaggerate, Obinna. But the boy seemed convinced. It is true. Obinna looked back at Chikezi. Do you know something else? What? The boy thought for a few seconds. Then he said something that made Chikezi feel an unexpected lump in his throat. When mummy is tired, she sits there. He pointed to a simple wooden chair near the window and looks outside. Chikezi looked at the chair. It was simple, worn out by use. Obinna continued. Sometimes she stays quiet for a long time. Ngozi looked down. Obinna, but the boy kept talking. One time I asked her what she was thinking about. Chikezi felt his attention focus completely on every word. And what did she tell you? Obinna answered calmly. That she was thinking about the future. Chikezi breathed slowly. Which part of the future? Obinna looked at his mother. Then he looked back at Chikezi. Mine. Silence filled the small house again. But this time the silence had a different weight, a much deeper one. Chikezi observed Ngozi. For the first time, he didn't see her as the woman who cleaned his house. He saw her as a mother. A Nigerian mother carrying the weight of a future on her shoulders, the future of her son. Obinna walked to the window, looked out at the compound, then spoke again. Do you know what else she says? Chikezi looked at him. What? Obinna answered with a small smile. That money can buy many things. Chikezi waited. Obinna finished the sentence. But it cannot buy time. Those words pierced something inside Chikezi, because for years he had sacrificed exactly that. Time. Time with friends. Time with family. Time with anything that wasn't business. All to build a life that now seemed incomplete. Obinna returned to the table, sat in front of Chikezi. Do you know something? What? The boy rested his arms on the table. I think that is why you came today. Chikezi raised his eyebrows slightly. Why? Obina looked him straight in the eyes. Because you wanted to talk to somebody. The statement was so direct that Chikezi didn't know how to respond. Maybe the boy was right. Maybe he had come all the way to Agege for a reason that not even he fully understood. Maybe it hadn't been curiosity. Maybe it had been something deeper, something that had been trying to get out for a long time. Ngozi gently broke the silence. Oga Chikezi, I didn't want all this to become. The sentence hung in the air. I didn't want all this to become uncomfortable for you. Chikezi shook his head softly. It is not uncomfortable. His voice was calmer now, softer. It is necessary. Ngozi watched him in silence. For years, she had worked in that massive mansion, never imagining that one day her boss would be sitting in her small parlor, listening to the story of her life. But there he was. No rush, no phone calls, no board meetings. Simply listening. Obina rested his elbows on the table. So, you are not sad anymore? Chikezi let out a small smile. A little less. Obina seemed satisfied with that answer. That is good. The boy got up and walked to the window again. Outside, the sun was slowly setting. The afternoon was turning into evening. A soft breeze slightly moved the plants in the small compound. Chikezi observed the scene for a few seconds. Then he looked back at Ngozi. I want to ask you something. Ngozi nodded calmly. Of course. Chikezi hesitated for a moment, but finally spoke. Why did you never tell me anything? Ngozi already knew that question. She knew that at some point it would come, because it was not necessary. Chikezi shook his head slightly. Now I understand something. Ngozi looked at him. What? Chikezi rested his hands on the table. For years I thought that success was building companies, making money, growing bigger every day. Ngozi kept silent. Chikezi continued. But today I realize that there are people who build something much harder. Ngozi tilted her head slightly. What do you mean? Chikezi looked toward Obina. The boy was playing with a small toy car near the window. To build a life. Ngozi didn't answer immediately, but her eyes reflected a calm emotion. Chikezi spoke again. And you have done it alone. Ngozi breathed deeply. Not completely alone. She looked at Obina. I have him. Obina raised his head from the floor. You are talking about me. Chikezi smiled. Yes. The boy returned to his game. Ngozi spoke calmly. We all have our struggles, sir. Chikezi nodded slowly. But not everyone faces them with the same dignity. Silence returned to fill the room, but this time it was a different silence, a lighter, warmer silence. Obina left the toy car on the table. Can I ask you something? Chikezi smiled. Sure. Will you come back? Chikezi looked at him in surprise. Come back? Obina nodded. Yes. To visit us. Chikezi hesitated. It wasn't a complicated question, but to him, it represented something new, something different. For years, his life had been full of strict schedules. Everything was planned, everything was organized. But now, that small house seemed to offer something his Lekki mansion had never had. Warmth, humanity, life. Chikezi looked at Ngozi. She said nothing. She just waited. Chikezi looked back at Obina. If you invite me. Yes. The boy smiled immediately. Then, you are invited. Ngozi let out a small laugh. Obina. But Chikezi smiled. I accept the invitation. Obina threw his hands up with enthusiasm. Yes. Then he walked toward the kitchen space. I am going to get more bread. Ngozi stood up quickly. There isn't much left. Obina stopped. Then we keep it for tomorrow. Chikezi watched the scene. That simple sentence reminded him of something again. In his house, no one ever thought of keeping it for tomorrow. There was always more. But here, every small resource had value. Chikezi stood up. Ngozi. She turned to him. Yes, sir. Tomorrow, I want you to come to my office. Ngozi frowned slightly. To your office? Yes. She looked confused. Did something happen? Chikezi shook his head. No. Then he looked again at the small house, the table, the window, the drawing book. I just want to make some changes. Ngozi didn't fully understand. Changes? Chikezi smiled softly. Changes that I should have made a long time ago. Obina returned to the table. Good changes? Chikezi looked at him. Very good ones. The boy nodded in approval. Then, it is fine. Chikezi walked to the door. The Agege sky was already getting dark. Before stepping out, he turned to Ngozi. Thank you. She looked surprised. For what? Chikezi answered with sincerity. Because today, you taught me something that no one had ever taught me. Obina raised his hand. I helped. Chikezi laughed. Yes. What did we teach you? Chikezi looked at the boy, then looked at Ngozi, and finally said something that came from the deepest part of his heart, that the true value of a person is not measured by what they have. He took a small pause. But by what they are able to give. Obina smiled. My mummy gives a lot. Chikezi nodded. Yes. Then he opened the door and stepped out into the small compound. He walked toward his G-Wagon, but before getting in, he stopped for a moment. He looked at the small house one more time, and for the first time in many years, he felt something different inside his chest. It wasn't ambition, it wasn't pressure, it wasn't the burden of business. It was something much simpler. Gratitude. Because that afternoon, in the humble Ageg house of his cleaner, the young billionaire Chikezi Okafor had discovered something that no business in the world had taught him, that the greatest wealth is not found in bank accounts, nor in luxury cars, nor in Banana Island mansions. True wealth lives in much simpler places, in a mother who hustles every day for her son, in a child who shares his bread, in a small house filled with love. And as the red G-Wagon drove slowly down the dusty road, Chikezi understood something that would change his life forever. Sometimes, the most important lessons in life are not learned in boardrooms. They are learned in humble kitchens, where the heart speaks louder than money.